welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Puig. I'm the program director for the Napa Valley Film Festival, and we're so happy that you're here. There's a parade going on here in Napa, as you probably all experienced, and I don't think a lot of us knew about that parade. I don't know if there's like spontaneous parades. It's a wine thing. But anyway, there are two people who may be stuck. So we're going to start, because we know you all have schedules and films to see in, and you want to hear from our wonderful panelists. So we're going to get started now, and when they come, they come. So
when they come, we'll throw things at them.
That's right.
Yeah.
We'll start our own parade. I have Elise Pearlstein on my left, who is the Senior VP of Participant Media. And on my right, I have Nick Gonda. I was going to say Dan Guando, for some reason those names.
Yeah.
Nick Gonda, who is the producing partner of Terrence Malick and has had many years' experience in the producing world. So we're going to talk about the different, you're more in the documentary side, you're more feature film side. So I want to talk about that. But one of the things I want to start asking you both is how the landscape is changing, because of there's so many ways to watch a movie now. It's not just going to the movies. So I know you've addressed this on another panel, but if we could start with Elise.
Yeah, I think everybody is really aware of how much things are changing, and that the industry has to change with the changes. A participant, we just had an interesting example. On the narrative side, we were involved in a film called Beasts of No Nation, and Netflix ended up acquiring the film, and it's the first time that a narrative film has kind of, that they did that, and we the decision was just that it would be the best for the film, that it would kind of help the film get a global audience and a global reach. They still did a theatrical release, but it was, Netflix came to the table, and everybody kind of had to say, this might actually be a good thing for this film. On the documentary side, we're really committed to theatrical releases for documentaries, but we're realizing more and more how all of the other platforms are essential, and that the role of the theatrical window has kind of changed from being the place where we're really expecting to, see the biggest audience and the biggest box office, to now having the theatrical kind of fuel the other windows and the other stages of the release. So I think it's still a little bit Wild West. People don't quite know what to do, but there is definitely a recognition that people see things everywhere, including on their phones, and how are we going to kind of adapt to that without sacrificing what we all believe films are films that should be seen in theaters and big screens, and we're not going to give that up, but we also have to see what's really happening.
And as a person who makes independent films and beautiful films that should be seen on a large screen, what does this mean for independent film? The change in how we're viewing films.
Well, there's an interesting. Let's see if this works. There's an interesting stat that is very telling about just the day and age that we're in. Nielsen did a poll last year, polling several 100,000 people on a Wednesday, saying, "Are you going to go to the movies this weekend?" And then they re-polled them on Monday, and over 80% of the people that said they were going to go see a movie this weekend, Monday revealed that they actually didn't go see a movie. And so, the reality is, we can ask ourselves, why is that? There's just so many things competing for our time, even within our own families, our own responsibilities. And then when you look at our entertainment allocation, there's so many other ways that we can spend our time than going to the movies. So as filmmakers, obviously that is an extra challenge. That means that we have to do that much more to be able to earn a slot in that compartment of the average person's time. So it means asking yourself way before distribution, what is going to make a critical mass of people care enough about it? Because the idea of having to get everybody, as independent filmmakers, we're not shackled to winning the weekend the way a studio would be. So then you think about, if you can get 100,000 people, 200,000 people to care enough to be able to go and see it, that's a strong opening that sets the groundwork for ultimately what could be a very strong release. So I think it's just a different mindset of thinking about who do you matter to, And that's obviously much more apparent, I think, sometimes to documentary filmmakers. We were talking about that in the green room. But it should be as apparent to narrative filmmakers. And then taking the time, as you would developing the screenplay and everything else, to really cultivate the relationship with audiences much more proactively than I think filmmakers of previous generations have had to.
How do you cultivate those audiences more proactively?
Well, first it starts with a mindset of just realizing that that is as important as anything else. And then it's a matter of allocating the responsibility. So social engagement is extremely important. It's something that starts small, but if you set goals every week to add and expand and engage and be consistent, then when you get to whatever it is, your festival cycle, your distribution cycle, it'll be a meaningful muscle at that point. There was a film, I think it was last year, Dear White People, I think that was last year.
I love that film, yeah.
That went to Sundance with over 100,000 social followers, not bought but earned engagements. And there were people you would see walking around Park City with t-shirts that were celebrating this film as though it was their own. And then the acquisitions people were looking around and looking at that and being impressed by that as much as they were by the film itself.
It felt like an event. People
It
are
did.
walking around and they're like engaged and they're wearing these t-shirts and they're carrying things around and you
Exactly.
think, I want to be a part of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the key thing. I want to be a part of that. And then it's not competing with what you could see on YouTube that night or what you could see on Netflix that night. That becomes a movement of sorts. And then that's what triggers the I'm going to actually go see the movie this weekend versus will I or maybe.
And participant media, by its very nature, by its very name, is so much involved in that. You want to tell people a little bit about how Participant functions?
So Participant is a company with a mission. It was founded by Jeff Skoll, who was one of the original eBay creators, and he just cares deeply about kind of the urgent, pressing threats around the world, and feels that a story well told can change the world, and that you can put your resources anywhere, but if you put them behind a really amazing story, it can reach people in a different way than other kind of philanthropic work would. Participant's not a nonprofit, by the way, but so we from the beginning, Participant kind of wanted to do impact and outreach campaigns around all the films, both the narrative and documentary films. So kind of what Nick is talking about, at a certain point we're thinking about audience pretty early, because we're thinking about what are these kind of concentric circles of audience, and that really have to start at the core. So we'll look at kind of the issues underlying the story and start to do the work way before release with our impact and advocacy people, and they work closely with marketing people to figure out how do you start communicating with this audience, and then by the time the film is released, we've already identified kind of who the core audience will be and what they're going to maybe want to do once they see the film. So for us, campaign communication engagement is really part of the distribution strategy of the film, on both the narratives and the documentaries.
With television going through sort of what most people are calling the golden age, or another golden age, and directors working in both film and TV, we're seeing a lot of that. Do you think that ultimately helps or hurts the film industry? Do you think it's very porous, or what do you think?
I think it is very porous. There's an interesting, I spent the last decade, as Claudia mentioned, producing for Malik, which brought me to Austin. And there's an interesting company out there that I encourage every filmmaker to look into. It might not be directly applicable to your work, but it's inspiring. It's called a company called Rooster Teeth. I was talking about it with somebody earlier, and they started just based a group of people that were passionate about nerd culture, comic culture. Started a site that they would create original content for. Became a YouTube sensation. Started having hundreds of thousands, now millions of followers. And this year, or last year, announced an Indiegogo campaign for their first feature that raised over $2 million within the first 2 weeks of the campaign. And that was because they cultivated this audience using short form content, over the top, now kind of television in a certain definition of it, and now we're becoming very passionate about long form feature content. And now the idea of who are we going to market to, where's our audience, that question's already answered for them, because it's been a relationship that they've cultivated. So I think that great directors, great actors, they're going to want to continue to go back and forth between the two. I think the great thing about television today is that it enables a community to be formed. I sometimes won't find out about a television show until 3 months, 4 months after maybe a lot of other people would, but I'm not too late, I could still catch up. Whereas obviously based on traditional windowing in film, if you don't have a lot of that critical awareness very early, then it's constituted as a failure or underperforming, whereas television does have the ability to build momentum over time, which is again why I think filmmakers can be taking lessons from that, distributors can be thinking more about that, and if you just don't think about the period of time where you're trying to cultivate that audience to be 3 months before you're released, but think more like a television, more like the over-the-top content owners thinking a year out, then I think we'll see much more successes in the film world that are more similar to what we're seeing in the television world right now.
When you talk about short form content too, that's a conversation that has come up with some of our filmmakers here too. You know, short films are always sort of seen in their own little world and maybe not given enough attention, and they were seen as calling cards.
Yeah.
And you have sort of the old model of, say, something like Whiplash. It was a short film and blown out into a bigger film. But now that we have there's so many venues and there needs to be content to fill it, do you see a change in sort of the perception of short films, the amount that will be needed?
Yeah. So, and for context here, in addition to the producing work, I'm also the co-founder of a company called Tugg, TUGG.com, which is crowdsourcing movies and cinemas, so enabling any film to go to any theater so long as there's an audience that's there that wants to see it. And that's basically Kickstarter for a showtime. If enough people commit to buying a ticket, then that showtime will occur. And so it completely democratizes the way that we now decide what movies play in what theaters, and giving power to the audiences and not just leaving that to industry professionals. And so we've seen a lot of uptick recently with short films, both in terms of compiling them into a feature night, so you can do 5-6 short films the way that they do with the Oscar shorts, for instance, as well as you look at music, and in the music touring world, you'll see opening acts ahead of, say, I think it was a group like Kings of Leon got a big break when Arcade Fire let them open up for their Suburbs tour. Now we're starting to encourage feature filmmakers that have an audience to provide a pre-show space to short form filmmakers to be able to have that exchange of audience. And there's a mutual benefit there, because a lot of times the short form filmmakers do have local following. And then that way the feature filmmaker is able to tie in there. So there's, by way of digital projection in theaters, enabling pre-shows, I think Alamo Drafthouse, a lot of these great theaters that have utilized the pre-show environment in a very innovative way. That's a huge opportunity for short form filmmakers. But then again, not to ignore the Whiplash example, a short film for filmmakers is something that there's a low barrier to entry. On the last panel, it was spoken about. You can get out there and do it. You don't have to wait for permission, with great crowdfunding sites out there like Seed and Spark, and obviously Kickstarter, Indiegogo. You can rally enough support, get that short made, and then with that, you can build momentum to really kickstart the next stage of your goals. So I think there's a dual benefit, obviously.
And at participant, where do short films fall in the spectrum?
We have a digital site and a television channel, and the digital world is looking for, a participant, but also in general, it's easier still to kind of consume and download and stream short content online. So there's definitely an interest there. I think I would agree that if you have a really good short film that you can use, that you can kind of take through the festival circuit and just start, it gives you a reason to kind of be in that environment and start building relationships, and it is a calling card. I think it's still a little bit of a leap sometimes when you to get the opportunity to go from short to long, but it is kind of within people's grasps, and the festivals really do kind of provide a mechanism to get your film out. And a lot of them now, at least for documentaries, you can use a lot of film festivals to qualify for the Oscar. You used to have to kind of four-wall a short film, but now there's a whole list of festivals that if you win an award from there, you're kind of eligible.
So you no longer have to open in New York and LA the way it was formerly.
For the shorts, they've now recognized that winning awards in certain festivals is kind of that counts to get you qualified.
That's great.
And one interesting story, an Australian filmmaker who took their short, and rather than trying to charge for it, put an email gate in front of it, basically saying, with your email address and zip code, you'll unlock viewing experience of this short. As a result of that and some publicity and social that they put around that, they were able to accrue tens of thousands of email addresses. And then when they went to launch their crowdfunding campaign for their feature, they started with a critical mass of support. So it's also looking at value in different places where it might be tucked away.
So with all these changes, where do you see, both of you see the industry in, say, 5 to 10 years? I know it's hard to, I mean, nobody has a, a crystal ball, but what do you foresee?
Well, for me, on the nonfiction side, it's really exciting because I think audiences have become less segmented. I mean, in some ways, you can target them very specifically, but people see things, see the janks, and it's riveting, and they don't think of that as kind of medicinal documentary filmmaking. So I think they're, the genres of kind of fiction, nonfiction, hybrid are all kind of evolving now, and I think it's just kind of a rich creative time. I mean, you're talking about the golden age of television. There's so much need for content. There's so many people creating content that I just think it's an exciting time. If you can figure out how to make a living, which is not always easy, but I don't see the demand for content diminishing. I just think the more, Amazon's, iTunes, Netflix, the more avenues there are to distribute, the more need there is for content.
Absolutely. What do you think?
Yeah, and obviously that question, with a full panel representing studio, representing television, representing film, there would be many different answers to that. Obviously what's happening in Asia, for instance, right now, 25 screens being built a day has massive impact on the entire community. But looking at it from a filmmaker standpoint, I think some of the examples that I was talking about before, Rooster Teeth, you'll see other companies emerging now from the whole kind of YouTube influencer entertainer communities, where it's not looking at a film as a kind of pop-up infrastructure and then the filmmakers go off to their next pop-up infrastructure, but filmmakers building communities around themselves or around the brand that they stand for, and that being able to grow and follow them over time. And I think that shift in mentality and practice is something that's going to provide more power and independence than ever before to filmmakers. And it's ultimately going to give audiences more of what they want and need. Because when you look at what ultimately compels people to buy anything, especially content or entertainment, it's not just because of, oh, this is good, or oh, I heard it was good. It's because they care about it, it matters to them, to their core fabric. And so I think that artists, especially filmmakers, have that ability, but ultimately I think based on the way that traditional distribution has been built, there's been an iron wall in between filmmakers and audiences. And that's what's coming down right now. With the over-the-top technologies, platforms like Tug, Vimeo, even Netflix, a lot of the practices that are employed by a participant, we're starting to see much more interaction between artists and audiences. And then if our artists are built in a way to accrue that and to analyze that the way that technology companies are right now, then there's just going to be a massive disruption to the way that this whole supply chain has worked. And I think that's a key thing when we look at some of the more exciting things that have been happening online. Online communities right now are explosive in terms of success. You're seeing someone like Amy Poehler, for instance. I sell her company, I think, to Churning or someone similar to that for hundreds of millions of dollars after 10 years of growth of work. And it's because it wasn't just based on individual pieces of content. It was a relationship with an audience that was called. Going back to that core thing, but I can't harp on it enough in terms of.
And she has, in addition to the relationship with the audience, she also seems to have, I don't mean to say an agenda, but sort of a
mission.
A mission, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
which is.
And that's something we didn't used to see before
Exactly.
with production companies.
Exactly
it's
right.
It's all about entertainment.
Yeah, but if you look at, say, Fox Searchlight's Facebook or social, and then you look at films that Fox Searchlight has distributed, some of those films have a larger social influence or social capital than the distributor itself. You look at Beasts of the Southern Wild, for instance. Now you look at its social channels, and they're basically stagnant. So it's a different mentality now for filmmakers to say, all right, I'm going to lend you my social capital as you release my film, but then I'm going to take it back and I'm going to do something with it. And as those are the things over the next 5 years, I think we're going to see filmmakers take more responsibility for their community, and as a result of that, have much more independence than they have in previous years.
When you talk about walls coming down, I think of what you do as you are a producer with Terrence Malick, and then with Tug, you were named by IndieWire as one of the influencers, and I think that very combination could not have happened 5-10 years ago, to do both things.
Yeah.
To come up with Tug, to be involved in distribution, also to be producing. You were a documentary filmmaker, now you've gone to participant. I mean, it seems like it's a really creative and interesting time for people making films, for people who are distributing films, just in general in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's frustrating to be dependent on, the studio, or dependent on, a big, having a lot of money to go out and make your films. I think that what we're seeing in both, creation of the content and distribution is more people saying, I'm gonna, there are so many more mechanisms to do it yourself that, you're not kind of limited by, having to go through all the traditional channels. But it is a lot of work. I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, the self-distribution, I've done a little bit of it, or, with Tug. You have to really, really, making the film is you're half done. If you really want to get your film out, you have to kind of put as much energy and kind of strategy behind how you're going to release the film as you have making it. So I think that's just important to realize, that you don't just kind of, I think in an older fashioned way, you make something, turn it over to someone else, and
another
they do
department
it.
Or something.
Yeah, and this time, like, you're doing it, and you have to. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's more work, but you also have more control.
More control, and more control to to your profits. If you're selling it, more control over how things are positioned. So it's empowering, but it's also a lot of work.
But so it's interesting, because where we are here in Napa, every I was fortunate to be here last year, and I was fascinated to hear about direct to consumer and how that's been a trend in the wine business, where previously, traditionally, winemakers here have gone through distributors, and there's the 3-tier system, and they know very little about who's ultimately buying from them, and obviously their profit margins are being cannibalized by all the middlemen in between. And every year there's an exponential jump. Direct to consumer maybe 10 years ago was under 10%, and now for some groups it's over 80%. And so I think it's just across industries there's this trend of people that are making something that's meaningful to somebody, trying to now reduce the barriers in between them and that end user, and as a result of that, make more money, but it is more work, and ultimately be able to build more community, so that you're not constantly having to remarket, but now you're able to cultivate ongoing relationships.
It's almost like, in general, maybe this is overstating it, but like the whole corporate mentality of departmentalizing is kind of breaking down a little bit in a lot of different industries.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in terms of both of your careers, because you've taken such interesting paths, what key pieces of advice did you get over the years that have influenced you or stayed with you, or that made a difference in getting you to where you are now?
I think being picky is really important. I think sometimes, especially when you're starting out, you're so grateful if someone wants to hire you, or someone wants to, but you have to. I mean, I worked with some people early in my career who had a long career, and they helped me. They kind of encouraged me to look at my career as a kind of holistic thing, and each choice you make is going to ultimately add up to what your career has been. So that's just that's something that I've done. I mean, I always had to pay my rent, so you do certain things and hope that they don't ever get on IMDb. But I also tried to kind of hold my ground each step of the way and do something that was meaningful. And for me, it really did help kind of add up to something, a career that I wanted to have, and to be a little bit more proactive than reactive. And it's just a hard thing to do when you're just so, eager to get the opportunities.
How about for you?
I think it was, at the time I heard it was incredibly frustrating, and but over time, it's definitely rung true. It was one of my first mentors was a great producer who passed away this year, Jerry Weintraub, and I asked him when I was just out of school. I was like, I want to be a producer. I was interning for on a film that he was producing, and at the end, I was able to get 5 minutes with him, and I said, I want to be a producer. What's your advice? And he said, you got to produce. And then he basically walked away. And then,
That's kind of tautological.
yeah, but the reality
Vague
is that
stuff.
when you look at his career, any producer in here knows it, that, if you wait for permission, if you wait for somebody to say now is your time or now is your film's time, it'll never, ever, ever come. And it's on you to be able to, my grandfather, a great man, a Holocaust survivor, he said, if you're not building castles in the sky, you're not building them anywhere. And so if you're not imagining your reality and dreaming of it, then ultimately it'll never be. No one will build it for you. And so I think that was Weintraub's advice, and ultimately I think something that I kept in my heart is that you just always have to work with what you have in front of you and build it, and then over time, A, that's the only way it'll grow, and B, it's the only way people will ultimately join your effort, as if you're the one who's utterly convinced it's going to get done.
Just plugging away.
Plugging away.
I also think you learn more that way. If you take something on and you have to kind of figure out how to finish it, you can learn, you can kind of cut through 10 years of work experience, just
Yeah.
by making something and feeling like no one else is going to tell you. You can rely on, people with more experience, but if you feel responsible and ownership over this thing and you have to finish it, you really do learn a lot.
So looking back at the things you've done, what do you, not that you've done, of course, so we'll be looking forward, but looking back now, what would you say are some of your proudest achievements?
Well, I'd say one of my proudest achievements was the first documentary I made, where I had actually worked in the narrative side of film, and I just kind of decided that I didn't really, I was always more inspired by the research that the stories were based on. And so I quit my job and traveled a little bit, and I came back and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I was sitting next to this old man named Paul Pink, who was the owner of Pink's hot dog stand, and I'm tangentially related to him, and he started telling stories, and I was like, God, someone should make a film about you, these are such amazing stories, and like the light bulb went off, and I was like, I'm gonna make a film about you. Little did I know, but that's why I'm saying, if you kind of, I felt committed to him. He passed away like 3 weeks after we started filming, and I had the only interview with him, and I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I have to finish this film. Like, I owe it to the family, and And it ended up, getting into the Los Angeles Film Festival, and the local PBS station acquired it, and it was a really great experience that proved to me that I could and should do this. So that was gratifying, just to kind of realize that if you have the idea, maybe you should be the one doing it.
Did you have a background in film, though? Did you go to film school?
No. I had always studied film, but I didn't know how to make a film. But I ended up, it took me a long time to make it because I was working at the same time, but I ended up being able to use the resources of where I was working to help. So I used the edit room, and the sound guy I was working with wanted to shoot something, so he shot for free. And I think it's the thing that people do in film school, but I just did it on my own. And then I think the second one would be Food Inc., which was just a film that, kind of with a perfect storm hit at exactly the right time when people were kind of ready to listen to it. And, it was really interesting. Our first day of shooting was in Sacramento in a trial about, why we shouldn't label GMO foods. It was like a hearing. And when we were shooting, I thought, God, it would be so great to come back and then I was back in Sacramento like 2 years later on a panel with Alice Waters and Martin Sheen, and we were talking to all of these people who voted against the thing, and I had that moment where I was like, oh my God, this happened, So I think it's really great when you can see the impact of your work.
Absolutely. How about for you? Proudest moments and achievements?
It's a tough one. I try not to look back. I think jumping from producing to the startup world has been many different types of challenges. So the fact that Tug is growing, and we're starting to grow internationally, and we have a really great team of idealists and doers. It's a great feeling to see that in 2015, when a lot of people are thinking theatrical's going out the door, that we're holding on to it as hard as we can, and I think that as a result of reconceptualizing kind of how we interact with theatrical, that it actually might stay around for quite a bit longer and reinvent itself. And so if Tug can be a part of that, that'll be proud
That'd
for
be
us all.
huge. Absolutely. You mentioned timing with Food Inc., and it's interesting because we talked about this another day about just, you don't know, but sometimes things are in the zeitgeist. Sometimes, and it's hard with a movie because it's going to come out later, obviously.
Right.
But how much? I mean, and I was thinking, we were having a conversation earlier about Tree of Life, and how there's certain films that come at a certain moment, and they just tap into the audience, and if other films just kind of go under the radar, and you think that was a great movie, and it gets found later, which is, I guess, again, going back to the distribution thing. It's nice to know that you can find a movie on Netflix later, but is timing as important now because of all that, or?
Well, obviously, from even just the more obvious things today, Bridge of Spies, unfortunately, their world premiere in France got canceled, and it's something obviously you never can plan for. You can go months and months and months, and then just the current events of our world can completely blindside you. Weather can completely blindside you, and you're at the whim of so many different factors when you're planning such meticulous release strategies. But then I think on a broader level, yes, I mean, you look at Imitation Game last year, that was tapping into what was one of our most important movements that was happening in our country, and that film told a story of a person who most people didn't know, and how it was obviously a timeless story that was directly applicable to this moment in time that we were facing as a country. And so I think that it's so much about how you can relate a discussion, not just expect, the culture to suddenly subscribe to your discussion, but how your film can then be embedded within, a vein of society that's active at that moment. That's, I think, a marketer's dream, to be able to have that kind of momentum to work with.
And to have that perfect storm where it's tapping into something that people are thinking about, and then also can lead the discussion further.
Exactly.
I think timing's really important. I mean, I mean, obviously the most important thing is having a great film. I think that has to drive everything. But there are a lot of examples of great films that just didn't hit at the right time. So I mean, you can do a lot to try to connect with whatever's happening through marketing, but to a certain extent, it's just sometimes you get lucky.
And then also, I think, we see this year, there's been a huge underperformance of films out in the fall because the traditional wisdom of everyone releasing these months. And then if the average person's going to 3 films a year and you're releasing in the 3 months where everyone is, then that's going to be a real challenge to be successful. So I think that, we're going to see more trends of counter-programming. We released Tree of Life in May, and then we had time to grow and expand over time so that by the fall, it wasn't about us trying to fight everybody else who's, with much more money at the time. And so I think, the idea of just this glut in the fall, as a result of this year's lackluster performance, I think we'll probably start to see more and more decisions of looking earlier in the year and going against it. Which is a very good thing.
You want it to be a year-round thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to open, there's so many of you here, and I know that you probably all have questions, or many of you have questions for our panelists, so I want to open it up, and there's one right here. But wait for the microphone, thank you.
So I understand very clearly that if you've got an issue-oriented feature or a documentary, I can envision how to build an audience. But I don't understand from a filmmaker's perspective if you're making a film that, it's the story you've got to tell. It's connecting with people who see it, but you don't know you don't know how to describe who the audience is. And like for example, with my fundraising campaign, it was 99% friends and family. No matter what I made, we would have got the same amount of money. I'm fairly convinced. And so it's I just can't grok how to build that for a non-issue oriented film, or what in my mind is a non-issue oriented film. How to establish to clarify what your audience is. It seems like something I asked this question to a film that I couldn't figure out at another festival, and I said, "What's your demographic?" And he goes, "I don't know." Beautiful film. I have no idea if it'll go anywhere, but I mean, I couldn't figure it out. Can you answer that at all?
Film-going audience.
Oh God.
People who appreciate art.
8% of our population makes up over 90% of our film-going community. But it's tough. I mean, honestly, I think that this is what I was talking about. It's a different mentality thinking about it from the time that you're starting to conceptualize what stories you're going to tell. In the technology world, one thing I've learned is that there's this methodology where there's something called an MVP, a minimum viable product, where an entrepreneur will have an idea, think, all right, this is good, interesting idea, but how do you test it ASAP and fail quickly if it's not necessarily going to have traction or relevance within, a marketplace? And I think as filmmakers, that's a great function of short films, or a great function of a crowdfunding campaign, is testing how does this resonate with people. But getting past that point and never asking oneself or yourself the question of who does this matter to beyond friends and family, obviously not knowing more about your particular film, I couldn't. There's no magic key to that. I think the magic key is thinking much earlier on about that, and then taking the time to really test those theories and learn who your film really matters to. One blanketed approach that I think is definitely something that I've seen help a lot of filmmakers who haven't been able to distinguish that core audience, is getting out there in front of their film. And so obviously what you're doing right now, film tours where you're able to go, and a lot of art houses are compelled to book if they know that the filmmaker is going to be there, and obviously they have to like the film, but being able to then go and learn who's coming up to you, how does your film matter to them, but you're going to have to listen a lot and test a lot, because ultimately the only way your film is going to scale is if you are able to answer that question. So I think as soon as you can get to that point, the better, and now it's about thinking of what can you do to test and learn and see who the film really is meant for.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for,
Microphone, sorry. You're coming from all directions.
hi, my name's Bill. Thanks for being here. In terms of a critical mass, you mentioned a critical mass that makes a difference in being able to move your project forward. I have a script that was just a quarterfinalist in the Academy's Nickel competition,
Oh, great.
which is great.
Congratulations.
There's work to do, and so I'm adapting it into a novel to try and build an audience that I can bring with the project to a potential buyer, or to get somebody interested. Is there a critical mass number that makes it will turn ahead or make a difference in terms of using that as another element to a package?
Do you want to?
I don't know. I'm just thinking, God, that seems like a lot of work. Isn't there an easier way?
You must love it.
into a novel.
Well, I believe in the story, and it's been a long journey with this story, and I'm not going to quit.
But I'm not sure how would adapting it into a novel, like what's your goal, and how does adapting it into a novel get you closer to it? Do you want to get it made as a film?
I do. From the screenwriter point of view, bringing source material, everybody's buying books because they bring an audience with them that can translate into a film. And so if you can create a novel out of, if you can create a book out of a screenplay to bring that audience with you, is there a meaningful number that would make a difference in somebody being more excited about it?
Somebody like on a development acquisitions
Right,
level.
yeah, a buyer, right.
I don't think there's like a certain metrics. If you get to 100,000 sales, then that'll trigger it. And I think to Elise's point, it is a lot of work. But if you're really passionate about writing that book for the sake of the book, not just as a means to make the movie, then go for it. Write that book, and that'll be obviously a part of you and a part of your canon of work. If you're doing it just as a function to get your script bought by way of what you just described, Nickel, it's obviously you have some good
Right,
traction,
something
and
already-
your energy might be better spent not focusing on other ways to cultivate audience, in ways that I described and others that we could talk about and you can hear about, and really focusing that energy on maximizing the script. But that obviously there's a lot of nuances that I know we aren't able to cover that you obviously are thinking about. But from a high level, I think knowing you only have X amount of time, and unless you really want to you write that book for the sake of that book in its own right, there might be other ways to achieve that function.
Thank you.
Let's see. Yes.
I'm a bit of a quant. I had never thought about the documentary side of a real event. My father was a cinematographer for Paramount when Paramount had a studio in New York. He got drafted, became a war correspondent, but then they sent him into Nazi-occupied Europe, to Norway and Copenhagen. And before he died, I sat down with him with a bottle of wine and hours of tapes to hear his story, what was going on. I learned the craft of screenwriting, did a couple of screenplays, and I finally said, okay, I think I know enough, and I wrote a screenplay based on true story, but not really, typical. Now that I'm hearing the documentary side of things, is that a good way to go with this kind of story? Because it's
Yeah.
an aspect of World War II that I think most people have never ever heard of.
Do you have access to the footage? Yeah, I mean, I mean, if you have that footage, then I would say definitely documentary, because there's so many really amazing documentaries told through archival footage, but you have a personal connection to it. And I mean, I think it could be both, but I just, I salivate at the idea of you sitting on that footage from a documentary perspective. So I think that would drive my decision if you could get access to that footage.
One footage I know we have that can be obtained is the Trafalgar Square VE Day, probably the most famous footage at the end of the war in Europe. My father shot that, but he was so drunk he didn't remember.
But you have tapes
Wow.
that you recorded with your father? You audio tapes that you recorded when you were drinking the
I
wine?
have that,
Yeah, I mean, I would just encourage you, there's just this kind of slew of documentaries out right now. Listen to Me, Marlon accessed all these audio tapes that Marlon Brando had, just dictated. So, when you have really cool source material, you can really do innovative stuff with it. That would be an interesting film for you to look at.
He was supposed to be one of the photographers at Nuremberg, and he got to go home. And he also was the man who obtained the film of the execution of the Nazi officers who tried to assassinate Hitler.
Wow.
So he's got a very colorful background.
Oh, yeah.
And he passed away about 10 years ago. Pretty interesting story.
Yeah.
As a viewer, I've been a critic for the last 15 years, and I can't tell you how many movies I've seen that I've thought that have been, loosely based on a true story, and I've thought, I really wish I'd made a documentary of this. Like even when I was watching
Truth is
Unbroken,
stranger than
I was,
fiction
yeah,
sometimes. Yeah.
and this like Unbroken, I'm thinking, I want to hear Louise Ambrini's real story. That would be so much more interesting to me. Not to take anything away from Angelina Jolie and what she did, but I am fascinated by the documentary form. So, I think. You know this better than I. As viewers, I'm not just saying this as a critic, as a viewer too, we're all becoming much more drawn to documentaries than the sort of, kind of Hollywoodized.
And that's a good subject matter for a documentary. There have been some really, really great documentaries done about photographers and filmmakers and Holocaust. So in terms of the audience and market, you would have a lot of kind of precedent to tap into.
And that generation is, as people constantly comment, is dying off.
Yeah.
And so it's all the more important to get those stories out there.
Yeah. And then also, I will just say that there's also a trend of feature films being made from documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
So Our Brand is Crisis was based on a documentary, and at Participant there are a couple, narrative films that are they option documentaries. So it's not an either or proposition necessarily.
Yes.
I have a question about a starting point when you have a finished project, very much like what these two gentlemen were talking about. Years ago, I was a professor of Holocaust studies and then went into high-tech launching startups, and that's what I do, so it spans those two worlds. But I put together a script idea that I then went to the UCLA screenwriting program with, of a film noir thriller based in Auschwitz. It became, the shorthand of the program was Sophie's Choice meets The Usual Suspects, and it actually came about very nicely, finished script about 6 weeks ago, etc. But the advice that I've been getting is so confusing. Be your own producer. No, find a producer. No, attach yourself to a director. No, find an entertainment law firm and have them package it up for you. It's like not even know where to start. You don't want to make any fatal first steps by going, I'm going this direction, when in fact I should have gone that. So I'm sure other people have got other finished projects, but what's the best starting point that if you were in someone's shoes like mine or some of the other people here?
And what do you care about most? You're the writer? Do you tend to
I'm
direct?
the writer. I wrote basically the Sophie's Choice part of the movie, and I knew enough to know that I couldn't write The Usual Suspects, the Act 2 elements. So I partnered with Richard Walter down at UCLA, and then he put me in touch with a couple of his graduates, and we finished it. it's not an economic thing for me. I just want to make a good film. There was a guy from NBC in the first 3 weeks called up and said, Richard Walter ran this by me. I'd love to see it as a mini-series or something, but it was just too soon to have those kinds of conversations till we finished it. But it's finished now. I just like to make a quality film sometime that my kids can look at and say, very cool. But, you know, what's your advice?
What I would say most fundamentally is just building out the team to be able to cover everything you just described. So yes, of course, ultimately bringing on a lawyer. The lawyer won't package the film for you, but the lawyer will help to protect and inform you to make the best decisions with how you create your financing offerings and everything else. You'll need, somebody who's experienced with raising money, who's experienced with dealing with agencies for cast, and so I think it's looking at your current team right now and acknowledging what you're great at. And then obviously great, that's covered, and then acknowledging areas that you need to supplement, and that's totally fine. You look at any great company, usually there's more than one founder that came and built a union so that together they were so much stronger, and so looking at those voids right now, and then being very picky and very selective with who you consider for those positions, and spend time really seeking and recruiting those partners. But I think step one is building out that muscle, forming that team. So and being totally comfortable with the fact that there's certain things that obviously you've done very well, you've gotten to this point, and then acknowledging those weaknesses or those areas that you're not as interested in, and then filling them. But I think that right now jumping to getting to the package or jumping, that's like trying to win the game before you have 5 players on the court. You need to get your team intact.
And I recommend you see a movie while you're here called Son of Saul, which is it's a thriller based in Auschwitz, so it's
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
It's wonderful.
Oh, okay, good, yeah.
This is a technical question. Do you have any advice for gaining music rights? Or from what I heard, it is if you want a song, you just compose it yourself, or you go find the artist to ask for the rights. And I know that it costs money. Do you have any advice for that at all? Or
So for a song, there's assuming that it's not in the public domain. So if it's Wagner or Mozart, then that's one thing. That means that there's usually just a master right? So the average song, if it's the Beatles, there's going to be 2 sides of licensing. One is called the master, and the other is called the synchronization. The master is the physical recording of, if I sing right now and it's being recorded, which you do not want to hear, then that would be the master. If I'm singing a Beatles song, then that's the publishing, that's the music. So there's 2 things that you'd have to license there. So in that case, it's finding a music supervisor, somebody who's, and there's lots of great people out there to protect you and best, help to negotiate. And then, when you look at what you need, there's different step deals. You could be doing it just for festivals. You can do a step deal based on performance so that you're not having to pay for all of the world in perpetuity when really all you might want is the next 6 months for your festival circuit. So I think first step is finding a music supervisor who's able to kind of walk you through that. And then, and also look online. You'll see a lot of great stuff on IndieWire, No Film School, a lot of other great resources, and you just type in, music licensing, and you'll see a lot of good information on there as well.
sorry, one more question. Do you have any advice for gaining rights on current or old novels to adapt into screenplays, or do you have to go and talk to the authors?
Publisher.
Publishers? All right.
Any more questions here? Oh, right over here.
The one I had, he sort of had a question that I had as well, but you covered that pretty well. On grant writing versus social media, I mean, I know that grant writing has been a good source of capital in the past. How does that work with social media? Do they work hand in hand? Is that something that's
Like crowdsourcing?
You're talking about like crowdfunding
Yeah.
versus grant writing?
I mean, and again, I know that there's grants available as far as government grants and things like that, but is it disappearing? Or is there more competition?
I think it's crowdsourcing can be faster. Usually the grant cycles can be slow. And at least in documentary filmmaking, there are more grants available now than there have been in the past. But you have to just look at what the foundations are funding, and then they have cycles. So if you need fast cash, you're not going to get it from a grant, but you could potentially do that by doing a Kickstarter campaign for a specific, like to get your script, whatever, you know, it's just faster. And you're building an audience at the same time.
And then getting back to the thing with the shorts, are shorts becoming more like what cartoons used to be in films, where you could actually catch a short?
Where you can what?
In a feature film, you know, you'd catch, instead of catching the cartoons at the
Some
beginning.
great theaters, you know, Alamo Drafthouse was one of the ones that really championed the pre-show, and now we're seeing a lot, just by way of the art house being a big community. Next month or 2 months from now, there's the art house convergence, and the week before Sundance, and that's when the majority of the art houses come together and share best practices. And as a result of that, you know, that exchange, we've seen other theaters now take advantage of that space, because obviously the audience loves that, not having just the local orthodontist, you know, advertisement being on before, but having an engaging entertainment pre-show experience. And so, yeah, that's happening more and more.
We have time for one last question. Someone over here had her hand up. Yes.
Well, with GoFundMe or crowdsourcing sites, your intellectual property rights, they would not be protected, right? I mean, how do you balance that? Like, just getting somebody to support your story, but making sure you're not giving away a story for somebody else to develop. How do you protect that?
Well, your IP still, I mean, if your chain of title is, you know, prepared correctly, meaning that the rights to the story and all of that is housed in an entity and all that, the crowdfunding.
Have that
yeah.
secured before you obviously go out and tell anybody.
Exactly, and then there's terms and conditions of these platforms that protect the creator from, you know, that risk. But it's an important thing that I would definitely advise if you're launching a crowdfunding campaign. Do a little bit of research about. You know, laws are changing right now by way of the equity crowdfunding and some of the other areas. It used to be up until recently, if you found somebody, if you did a Kickstarter campaign and then somebody says, oh, I actually want to invest $100,000 in your film, you couldn't take that investment if it came by way of a publicized crowdfunding campaign. Rules like that have been changing recently, where you actually can take equity. And so it's good to look at the nuances, but from an IP standpoint, just because you're doing a crowdfunding campaign doesn't mean you're giving away the IP.
I want to say a very enthusiastic thank you to Nick Guando and Elise Pearlstein for your wonderful
Yeah, right? Fireside chat.
You're so great.